Welcome to Navy Paints. In this video I'll be showing you how I made and painted the vat that's containing the dangerous specimen NP83. With that, let's crack in. To make the vat, I've used an empty salt and pepper shaker, some random bits from my bits box, different types of plasticard including plasticard sheets, and some wires and other components from an old radio. The first thing I did is cut 2 strips of plasticard about 2 centimeters wide, and using some super glue and a lot of rubber bands, I wrapped a piece of plasticard around the top and the bottom of the container, applied some PVA glue on the inside and let that dry overnight. Once the PVA glue had fully dried, using a hobby knife, I carefully cut the excess plasticard away, trying to make it as flush to the jar as possible. To mount the glass vat, I've used balsa wood. I've simply placed the vat onto the balsa wood, traced around it, and then cut the middle out. With the hole cut out, I placed in the vat and glued into place using super glue. Using the plasticard sheet, I've just traced around the top of the vat, cutting out the circle, and this will form the lid for the vat. To reinforce the balsa wood, I've cut a piece of plasticard the same size, glued that to the balsa wood, and then trimmed off any excess. For the flooring around the bottom of the vat, I've gone with this textured plasticard I've picked up from a hobby store. I've cut a piece to the required size, then roughly cut out a circle using a pair of scissors so I can fit this around the bottom of the vat. Once I was happy with the shape, I then glued it into place using super glue. Now it's on to the fun part, gluing on the details of the vat. For the piping around the base of the vat, I've gone with this flexible piping and just glued that around the base using PVA glue and super glue. With one end of the pipe, I've bent it at a 90-degree angle. I've done this so I can attach it to the back of the control panel. To make the control panel, I've used a sponson from a Lehman Russ battle tank, some plasticard, and some spare parts and wires from an old radio. For the other areas of the vat, I've filled in little details such as vents, a hatch at the top, a little light, and some extra wiring. To neaten up the edges of the piece and blend them in a bit better, I've gone with angled pieces of plasticard rod, cut them to size and stuck them on using super glue. For the corners, I've used epoxy putty to roughly match the angles on the plasticard rod and blend them in. Or to fill in any spots around the machinery where I've got a gap or the joints aren't flush. After that was done, I let the epoxy putty dry overnight. Once the epoxy putty had cured, I used a hobby knife to cut away any excess and a file just to sand it down. With that done, the vat is now ready to be painted. Before airbrushing, I've masked off the glass using electrical tape. This will avoid any paint going on while I'm airbrushing. With that taped off, now it's time to give the vat an undercoat. I've gone with Vallejo's surface primer. I've run this through the airbrush with a little bit of Vallejo's flow improver mixed in, and given the entire vat a coating of this colour. With the undercoat dry, now I've gone over to True Copper from the Army Painter. Again running this through the airbrush with a little bit of flow improver mixed in, and sprayed on this colour until the entire vat had a nice even coverage. This next paint here is Chipping Medium from Vallejo. It's a clear paint. I again run this through the airbrush, but this time without the flow improver mixed in. I gave the entire model a light coat of this colour. You can go heavier if you want, but the heavier you go, the more cracks you'll get when you apply the paint on top. Once I was happy with the amount I've applied, I let it dry for 20 minutes. With the chipping medium down, now I've gone over to Spaceship Exterior from the Army Painter. Again applying this through the airbrush. I've given the entire model, except the floor, a coat of this colour. Once this colour begins to dry, a few cracks will start appearing. This is one of the effects of the chipping medium, so don't be too concerned when this happens. If you find there are too many cracks or they're just too big, just wait for the crack to separate fully and just give it another coat of the colour you're using. And the final colour to run through the airbrush is Plate Mail Metal from the Army Painter. With this colour, I've just tried to keep it on the floor as much as possible. If I did happen to get a little bit of overspray onto the other parts of the model, it wasn't a big concern, as I'm going to apply a lot of heavy weathering to the model, so I can always hide those little mistakes. For the pipe around the base of the vat, I've gone with Deep Blue from the Army Painter. For the different colours of the wires, I've just mixed those up with Carmine Red from Vallejo, Pale Yellow from Vallejo, and Greenskin from the Army Painter. All four of these colours were applied straight from the pot with 2 to 3 thin coats each. The red button on the panel was also painted with the Carmine Red, and all the silver areas around the model I've painted with Plate Mail Metal from the Army Painter. Brushing on this colour required 1 to 2 coats. With all the base coats down, now I've carefully peeled the tape back off the model. Once I removed all the tape, with a toothbrush and a bit of water, I've just wet the entire model. And using a small stippling brush, I've carefully started to remove the paint around the model until I was happy with the amount I've taken off. Now onto the weathering stage. This is Rust Texture from Vallejo. This is one of their environmental paints. When applying this or the other technical paints from Vallejo, I always mix up the amount of water I put in the paint. Doing this will give you different tones of the paint and different textures also. The best way I found to use the Rust Texture is to apply a bit of the paint to the area you're wanting to do. Once I apply the paint to the area, I just use my finger to drag the paint down towards the bottom of the model. For any flat areas like the lid or the floor, I'll apply the paint in the same way, and instead of dragging down, I just use my finger to move it around from side to side. This will just give it a nice natural look, like rust is spreading out over time. This next colour is an environmental colour from Vallejo. This is Slimy Grime Light. With this colour, I just put it around the parts of the model where I think grime might have built up over time. So coming out of air vents, any place where moisture might gather, and any part of the model might make it look a little bit cooler or change up the colour. The next colour here I'm putting on is Petrol Spills from Vallejo. This is painted straight out of the pot. With this paint I'm only applying it to areas where I think machinery might be moving and working, and also on the floors around those machines. This will represent spillage and leakage of the materials. The next colour to apply to the model is Nihilakh Oxide from Citadel. With this colour, I've just applied this to all the metal areas of the model. This is done just to represent the oxidization of the metals. I found with this colour, if you apply too much, it can be overbearing. So it's best to apply a little bit of this colour to an area, let it dry, see what it looks like. If you're not happy with it, just apply a little bit more and build it up slowly. Because if you go too heavy, it's harder to remove this colour than it is to just add some more. This next colour here is Oil Stains from Vallejo, and just like the petrol spills earlier, I've applied it in the exact same way, just applying this onto the machinery and the floors, and on any other area of the model where moving parts may be. This next step here is applying pigment to the model, so I've used Pigment Binder and light yellow ochre pigment from Vallejo. First I put a bit of Pigment Binder on my brush and dab that onto the area I want to apply the pigment to. Then I go into the dry pigment and dab that onto the area where I've placed the Pigment Binder to seal it on. Like the oxide earlier, it's better to go lighter with the pigment and add more later than go heavy, as it's a bit of a pain to remove. Now it's time for the resin pour. The resin I've gone with is from a company called Inklab. This is a 1:1 clear epoxy resin. Here I've put 2 equal parts into a plastic cup, added in a few drops of fluorescent yellow from Vallejo. This is from their Mecha range. I carefully stirred this around until it was mixed together thoroughly. Once it was mixed together, I placed the alien in the tank and then poured in the resin. I was a little short, so I made up a little bit more and just topped up the tank. Because I had to top up the tank with extra resin, I wanted to make sure they were mixed together thoroughly. Inside the tank, I used an ice cream stick and I mixed those 2 parts together. I wiped the excess resin from the icy pole stick on the edges of the top of the tank, and then I set the lid on top. I then left this to dry for a few hours. When I came back to check, I had a disaster on my hands. The tank lid had sealed shut, not letting any air escape, which then caused the air bubbles to just stop halfway or stick to the glass of the container. This is what I was left with after about 2.5 hours. As you can see, the air bubbles have started to stick to the edge of the container, the bottom, and a really bad air bubble on the back, and a bunch of little air bubbles have stuck to the alien inside. I was about to write off the project at this point, and then I kicked into stupid mode. First I drilled a few holes in, trying to pop the bubbles. That didn't work. So I started pushing down with pliers, and I found that the resin was hard on top and in the center, but on the outside it was still playable. So I just kept pushing the resin down and releasing, slowly trying to remove as many air bubbles as possible and break up the bigger ones on the side of the container. I've done this for about an hour, getting decent results, and right at the last second I pushed too hard and I cracked the container like an idiot. Thankfully the dark gods of chaos were watching over me and none of the resin leaked out of the side. Gently folded the glass until I got rid of the sharpness and it was blunt. Filled the gap with a little bit of super glue. I then added an extra piece to the back to represent a little pump pumping in the bubbles, and to cover up all the mistakes of the drilling and plies at the top of the tank, I made myself a little stencil, painted that on, and weathered all these new extra bits just like I did earlier. The paint used on the stencil was Spaceship Exterior from the Army Painter, and I sealed that in with a matte varnish from the Army Painter. Here I am extending the water damage, just using some Slimy Grime light. This will help make the model look a lot cooler and also hide any mistakes I made. Also, if you're interested, here's a link to a video on how I painted the alien inside the tank. And here is specimen NP83 laying dormant in some forgotten laboratory. Thanks for watching AP Paints. If you liked the video, please click the sub button or leave me a like. If there's anything you'd like to see in a future video, please leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.